So I am here today to film my 5th video in my Harry Potter and Classics series, which is of course all about Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. I say about Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix loosely because these videos are far more about the mythology and the ancient history behind the names and characters of Harry Potter than they are about Harry Potter themselves. So if you're not a massive Harry Potter fan, if you don't know all of these niche character references that I might draw up in these videos, that doesn't really matter, because what I'm hoping that you will get from these videos is an introduction to some ancient history and ancient mythology. If you haven't seen one of these videos before, I basically go through all of the characters and creatures that are introduced in each of the Harry Potter books, who specifically have origins in classical mythology or ancient history. Like I mentioned in the introduction to the series, J.K. Rowling herself did classics, and there's so many classical references in her books, and I thought it would be fun to provide a little background to all of those. But if you haven't seen those videos, I will link the playlist down below where you can check out episodes 1, 2, 3 and 4, and hopefully in the meantime you will enjoy this episode right here. So without further ado, I'm going to kick things off with the Centaurs. Now the reason I'm starting with the Centaurs is because these are one of the few magical creatures or characters in the Harry Potter universe that I haven't talked about the first time they were introduced to the series. As many of you will know, there were centaurs in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and they played a significant role in the plot. However, I always plan to save them for this video right here, and I think I might have mentioned that in one of my earlier videos, because I think the way that the centaurs are represented in the Order of the Phoenix is a really nice example of the two different sides there are to centaurs. Centaurs in mythology very much have two sides to them, and the centaurs in the Order of the Phoenix very much have two sides to them. There is the super intelligent, philosophical, intellectual side, which is perhaps best demonstrated by the fact that one of the centaurs, Firenze, ends up becoming a teacher at Hogwarts in the book. But there's also an incredibly violent and, in ancient Greek terms, uncivilized nature to the centaurs, which you also see when the centaurs threaten human lives at Hogwarts and kidnap Dolores Umbridge, as much as she was an atrocious human being. They definitely show a little bit more of their violent side in those instances. So if you haven't gathered already, centaurs do originate in ancient Greek mythology. In fact, one of the earliest centaurs that we actually know about dates as far back as the ancient Greek Dark Ages. So before the height of what we know as the kind of classical Greek civilizations, during a period where writing dies out between the kind of Mycenaean civilizations and the classical Greek civilizations, we have in one archaeological site found this centaur, which is often known as the Lefkandi centaur because that is where he was found, and he's this little terracotta statue of a man with a human torso and head, but with the body of a horse, so the legs and the body of a horse, as I'm sure you know. As long as Greek mythology has been around, centaurs have been playing a large role in their myths. Now, there's far too many myths about centaurs to really go into detail here, but like I mentioned, there are these two sides to the centaurs, and so I'd like to mention two instances of centaur behaviour. First up, we have one of the most famous centaurs of Greek mythology, who is Chiron. The reason Chiron was so famous is because he actually trained numerous different ancient Greek heroes, all the way from Heracles to Achilles. He's in fact kind of represented in place of a centaur by a faun or a satyr in the Disney movie Hercules, where Phil teaches Hercules how to be a hero. So basically Chiron fulfills the same role in mythology that Phil does in the Disney film. The centaurs themselves were originally born to the Titan Kronos, who was also the father of the king of the gods Zeus, and a sea nymph named Philyra. Not all of Chiron's brothers, however, were as well respected as he was, and this is because of what happened in the run-up to what is known as the Centaurimachy. Now, the Centaurimachy was essentially a massive battle or war between the centaurs and the Lapiths. Machy coming from the ancient Greek word to mean battle or war. The Centaurimachy itself was a result of the behaviour of a specific group of centaurs at a wedding. Now, the Lapiths and the centaurs found themselves face to face at the wedding of Pirithous, and what happens is that the centaurs get quite inebriated. It turns out that they cannot handle their alcohol, and it results in one of the centaurs, Eurython, attacking the bride herself and attempting to abduct her. The Lapiths and centaurs proceed to battle it out, and eventually the centaurs themselves are thrown out of Thessaly, which is where the Lapiths live. You can even see the battle depicted on some of the most famous architecture of all of ancient Greece, which is the Parthenon, and some of the marble metopes of which depict this war. Because of incidents like this in Greek mythology, centaurs have this strange dynamic where they are sometimes represented as incredibly wise, but equally well known for their brutal behaviour towards men and women. But coincidentally, the centaur Maki is not the only famous battle of Greek mythology that I'm going to talk to you about in this video, and that's because one of the other creatures that we're introduced to for the first time in the Order of the Phoenix is the giants. Now, those of you who have read the book will know that Hagrid, the groundskeeper and care of magical creatures teacher in the books, is half human, half giant, and in the Order of the Phoenix, he comes back from a mission as an envoy to the giants with his half-brother, who is full giant. Giants themselves are a common feature of Greek mythology and come in all different forms. They are sometimes the bad guys, but they're not always the bad guys. We have Cyclops, which are one-eyed giants. We have other giants who have hundreds of arms, and in some instances, giants aren't even that much bigger than humans, they're just much stronger, and that's what defines them. But like I mentioned, they did get into a little bit of fighting, and in fact we also have a famous battle known as the Gigantomachy, which took place between the races of giants and the Olympian gods, made up of all the big deities like Zeus and Poseidon and Hera. The giants were actually the children of Gaia, or the earth goddess, that came before all of the other gods, and she had always had a massive soft spot for her children, who many tried to ostracize from the sort of divine realm because of their appearance. The giants, however, posed a threat to the Olympian deities, and they were worried that the giants' strength would mean that they would one day overthrow them. A prophecy, however, suggested that the only way that the giants could be defeated was through the help of a mortal as opposed to the gods. And this is where Heracles once again comes in. Heracles is, you know, always coming to the aid of his dad, Zeus. With the help of the gods, Heracles went up against the two strongest giants of them all, while the rest of the gods played their part in defeating some of the other giants and making sure that they no longer posed a threat to the Olympians' rule. You can read about this myth and quite a few of the other myths I'm going to talk about in Apollodorus' Library of Greek Mythology, which collects together various different myths in one place, and is such a great place to start if you're looking to read a little bit more Greek mythology. Plus you'll find various other giants making themselves known within its pages. But moving on from magical creatures in the world of Harry Potter to characters themselves. A character we're introduced to in the Order of the Phoenix is Hestia Jones, a member of the Order of the Phoenix, which is of course an independent group in the Harry Potter world set up to defend the Wizarding World from Voldemort. And like all the characters I'm going to mention in this video, Hestia gets her name from antiquity. Not the Jones part, but the Hestia part. Hestia was actually in fact one of the ancient Greek Olympian gods. She was one of the three virgin goddesses alongside Athena and Artemis, and was specifically responsible for the hearth, or the home. Because of this, Hestia was actually one of the most important Olympic deities to the everyday lives of ancient Greek people. As goddess of the hearth, she was regularly prayed to on a daily basis and received the first offering in every sacrifice made within the household. So whether they were sacrificing meat or pouring wine out to the gods, Hestia got first dibs. Despite her importance to ancient Greek life though, she's probably not one of the goddesses who's quite as well known today, or actually appears in as many mythological stories as somebody like Zeus or Poseidon. That's also probably because she wasn't constantly sending mortals to war with one another, so there ain't a lot of epic poems about her. She was one of the first generation of Olympians alongside her brothers and sisters, which were Poseidon, Hades, Zeus, Hera and Demeter, all of which were the children of Kronos and Rhea, the Titan generation that the Olympians eventually overthrew. And despite both Poseidon and Apollo expressing interest in her, she decides to forswear marriage and any relationships with male deities for virginity instead. Another member of the Order of the Phoenix who takes their name from classical mythology is NYMPHODORA TONKS. Now it's hard not to see the name NYMPHODORA and just immediately think of nymphs. That's where my mind goes. NYMPHODORA is one of the probably more prominent members of the Order of the Phoenix throughout the next few books, preceding book 5, and she's also one of my personal favourite characters. But rather than taking her name from a specific person in Greek mythology like Hestia, she instead has a name that originates in a type of goddess. So the nymphs were all female goddesses of a sort of lower echelon than the Olympians, for example, and that were responsible for all the various different aspects of nature. So you had sea nymphs, you had forest nymphs, etc, etc. And they're sometimes known by their individual groupings. For example, there are nereids, who are the nymphs responsible for the sea, or naiads, who are responsible for streams and rivers, and even oreads, who are responsible for mountains. Nymphs appear in various different scenarios in ancient Greek and Roman mythology. For example, they're often found following much larger deities like Artemis, who was accompanied by a regular retinue of 16 nymphs. However, they too, like her, were expected to remain virgins, as she was one of the 3 virgin goddesses like Hestia. And this went so far that when one of her nymph followers, Callisto, was raped by the god Zeus, Artemis punished her by turning her into a bear because she could no longer stand to have her as one of her followers. Cruel, but something we probably shouldn't be surprised about this far in our journey into learning about Greek mythology, because it's pretty standard behaviour, unfortunately. One of the other probably most well-known nymphs of ancient mythology is Daphne, who the god Apollo fell in love with when he was shot with Eros's bow. Apollo then pursues Daphne, who has forsworn men and is not interested in Apollo. When she realised she would be unable to escape Apollo on foot, she prayed to her father Peneus, who was god of the rivers, to turn her into a tree in order to stop Apollo from raping her. You can read this myth and many like it in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is an epic Latin poem all about different characters in Roman mythology who turn into something else, aka metamorphosis. Let's shake things up a little bit though, because I don't always talk about characters from mythology in these videos. I also talk about historical figures, because as many characters that are named after mythological characters in Harry Potter are also named after historical figures. For example, in the Order of the Phoenix, we meet Tiberius Ogden. Now, Tiberius Ogden comes up in the Order of the Phoenix as a member of the Wizengamot, which is part of the wizarding legal system, who resigns in protest of the Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge's appointment of Dolores Umbridge to Inquisitor at Hogwarts. And he is, of course, named after the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius was, in fact, the second ever emperor of the Roman Empire. He was the stepson of Augustus, the first ever emperor, whose wife Livia had given birth to Tiberius during her first marriage before she married Augustus. As Tiberius wasn't Augustus's legitimate son, Augustus did take measures to make sure that he was perceived as part of the imperial family during his life. He both adopted Tiberius and also had him marry his own biological daughter, Julia the Elder. Tiberius had a decent run of it as emperor, reigning from 14 to 37 AD, so 22 years in power. He was originally meant to be succeeded by his adopted son Germanicus, but Germanicus died before Tiberius, so instead he was succeeded by the third Roman emperor, Caligula. Now, although Tiberius managed to reign for a significant amount of time and lived to a pretty decent age for that period in history, some of the ancient sources do believe that Caligula played a part in his death. We may never know whether Caligula had a hand in the death of his adopted grandfather, but what we do know is that Caligula was pretty cunning, because according to Tiberius's will, he was only meant to be one of 2 emperors. However, upon Tiberius's death, Caligula had his will invalidated, making him sole ruler of the Roman Empire. If you're ever curious about Tiberius or any of the other early Roman empires, 2 of the most complete sources we have for this period of imperial history are the Roman writers Tacitus and Suetonius. Back to myth we go though with our next character, who is Phineas Nigellus Black. Now, Phineas Nigellus Black is actually long dead before the events of the Harry Potter series, but who we do meet is his portrait in the Order of the Phoenix. He is, of course, one of Sirius Black's distant relatives, as well as one of the previous Slytherin headmasters of Hogwarts. In Greek mythology, Phineas was actually originally a king of Thrace, who ends up becoming a seer who is basically tortured by the gods on a regular basis. We learn in Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica that thanks to Phineas's abilities as a seer, he was able to reveal the future of mankind against the wishes of the gods. So they decided to punish him by having him blinded and sent to live on this island, where whenever he goes to eat from this luscious feast that they have laid out for him, he is attacked by the mythical harpies, who are half women, half bird creatures that do the bidding of the gods. In Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, Jason and his companions are journeying to retrieve the golden fleece from the king of Colchis. On their way, they end up on Phineas's island, and in return for him helping them find the safest route to Colchis, they get rid of the harpies on his behalf. They lay in wait for the Harpies to attack, and when they come down to steal the food from Phineas's hands, they strike themselves, driving them off for good. Once they've completed this task, Phineas then explains to the Argonauts and their leader Jason that they must travel through the clashing rocks, which are two essentially cliff faces that smash together against one another in the sea so that ships are unable to pass without the risk of being crushed between them. Phineas, however, is able to explain to them how best to get past them, which will then get them to Colchis the quickest way possible. And then last but not least, we have another historical figure, although this one is Greek, and that is thanks to the character of Hippocrates Smethwick. So a little bit on the niche side, some of you may recognise the name Smethwick as Healer Smethwick from St Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies. We end up in St Mungo's when Arthur Weasley is bitten by a magical poisonous snake that we also know as Nagini, and is sent there to stay over Christmas while he heals. The healer, or the magical equivalent of a doctor, in charge of Arthur's ward, which is of course the poisonous bites section of the hospital, because you need one of those, is Healer Smethwick. And if you didn't know, Smethwick's first name is actually Hippocrates. Now this is particularly appropriate, and some of you may already know why, because Hippocrates is one of the earliest and most famous ancient doctors. Okay, there were doctors and healers long before Hippocrates, but the reason Hippocrates is so famous is because of his medical texts. Fascinating from a historical perspective, absolutely atrocious from a modern medical perspective, but even if a lot of the stuff he said was nonsense, he's still pretty important in his endeavour to write a medical text, which is pretty rare and unheard of prior to Hippocrates. One of the major aspects of Hippocrates' work that has continued to attract respect from those in the medical profession is that he acknowledged that illnesses and disease were not something caused by the gods, but were instead something that was the result of natural phenomenon. However, some of this natural phenomenon involved him theorising that women's wombs were not attached to the rest of their body and instead had the ability to float around and possibly choke them. I mean, I think we've cut open enough cadavers at this point to know that that's not true. But those are all of the characters and magical creatures that I have noted from the Order of the Phoenix that have their origins in ancient history or classical mythology. As always, apologies if I missed any, but hopefully these videos are reasonably thorough, and I hope you have enjoyed perhaps learning something a little bit new, whether you're a Harry Potter fan, classical mythology fan, or a bit of both. Do check out my previous videos in this series if you have not seen them already. I will of course link any books mentioned in the description box down below, and if you're just generally interested in learning more about ancient history and classical mythology, then do check out my podcast, That's Ancient History, which will also be in the description box. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!